There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as routine appointments, as forms to fill out and polite coffee offered at the back of a waiting room. And only later do you understand that something, quietly and irreversibly, shifted. I told myself I was there for the paperwork, insurance questions, lists of medications, the predictable recitation of symptoms, but what I learned in that small, windowless office was not how to cut down on caffeine or how to name my anxiety. What I learned was how to accept a presence that refused to be contained by polite habits or well-meaning distance. It began, absurdly, with the soft knock of a therapist's folder against a table and ended with me learning to let someone stand at the threshold of my life and not press the door closed out of fear. I had been the kind of person who knew how to contain things neatly. My apartment reflected that. Stacks of photographs sorted by color and year, a line of plants on the windowsill ordered by height, shoes squared at attention in the closet. When anxiety arrived, when it dragged me awake in the small hours and left the room around my ribs like a weight, I folded it into patterns I understood. I photographed it sometimes, because taking pictures translated anxiety into something I could hold. A shallow breath captured as a blurred hand, a restless night as a streak of city lights. Photography had taught me how to look closely without getting burned by what I saw. It made me patient, made me careful, and it made me skilled at being alone without feeling hollow. The therapist, Dr. Marcus Bennett, was recommended by someone from a support group I had only half listened to, the kind of suggestion you jot down and then forget until you need it. I called, set an appointment for Thursday afternoon, and gave the receptionist my insurance information with the kind of precision I reserved for camera settings. When I arrived, I sat in the waiting room and read a magazine I did not care about. I watched the geometric light from the blinds make neat bars on the carpet. The therapist's office was small and tasted faintly of lemon and old paper, the type of place meant to be neutral and non-intrusive. Marcus greeted me with a wide, unassuming smile, the sort of open face that made you suspect how many people felt comfortable telling him things in a hurry. He asked the right questions the first day. He had a soft, low voice like a recorded message, and eyes that tracked the exact point where you stopped lying to yourself. For the first few sessions, we traced the maps of my anxiety, the triggers, the rituals, the seasons when it sharpened like frost. He taught me breathing techniques that seemed almost painfully simple but, practiced long enough, became the small rescue that held me afloat when panic tried to rewrite the rules of my body. He assigned me tasks light, compassionate challenges meant to nudge me toward discomfort, and at the end of every hour he nodded as if to say that the work we did could always be carried out step by step, like the slow knotting of a rope. Marcus had a routine, and routine was my friend. He met me in that office on Thursdays, and then he began to ask me about the parts of my life that felt less like a disorder and more like an unlit room. He noticed my photographs and asked about them in a way that made me bring out a small portfolio one afternoon and sit on his couch, angle the pages under the lamp, and explain to him why a certain late summer light looked like forgiveness. He listened without flinching at the ways I described myself, introverted, guarded, patient, with the kind of attention that suggested he saw the architecture of a person rather than the scaffolding. It was from Marcus that I learned how to say the word loneliness without a whisper of shame. He had a way of naming feelings as if they were rooms in a house, important, navigable, sometimes in need of painting or repair. Loneliness is not a condemnation. He told me in one session, tapping a pencil against a folder. It's a signal. It lets us know where to build a new doorway. He taught me to notice the difference between being alone and being lonely. And he taught me, too, to begin thinking about what I wanted my doorway to look like. It was, as so many changes are, the small, repeated gesture that opened my life. Marcus suggested a group therapy night, a small cohort of men who met weekly to talk about anxiety and daily routines. He spoke of it as if describing a marriage of convenience rather than a romance, practical, useful, maybe even pleasantly awkward. I told him I did not do groups. I liked the singular conversation of a one-on-one appointment. I liked the careful architecture of our sessions. He smiled and did not insist, but he left me a pamphlet anyway. Comfort is the enemy of growth, he said, folding the pamphlet into his palm as if tucking a secret into his sleeve. There was a gentleness to his insistence that made it feel less like pressure and more like an invitation. The group met on Wednesday evenings at a community center with a noisy kettle and an abundance of upholstered chairs. I went once because Marcus told me to, and because I wanted to prove to him that I could show up for things that frightened me in ordinary ways. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old coats. People arrived with the same practiced anonymity you find in waiting rooms: tucked collars, observant smiles. We sat in a loose circle. My plan was to say nothing and to take it in like a series of textures I could catalog later. The leader, a woman with an easy laugh, asked us to introduce ourselves. I offered a name and the barest of information about my work and my tendency to collect photographs. When it was the man next to me who spoke, I listened, as I always did, for the inflection that would tell me whether someone was offering a map or a mirage. His name was Jonah. He was younger than I had expected and carried himself as if he were always half finished with a joke. He had the kind of restlessness that kept the room on its toes, fingers drumming an absent rhythm on his knee, a loose energy that suggested athleticism, movement that suggested someone used to calling himself into motion. When he laughed, the sound was quick and disarming, and his eyes bright, dark, caught on details like a camera lens autofocus. He said he was there because a breakup had left him with whole empty hours that made his chest ache, and he spoke about anxiety as if it were a blunt instrument he had dragged around and tried to dull by running. We spoke after the meeting because he folded himself into the doorway as I put on my coat. He laughed about how the kettle took forever to boil and asked casually about my photographs. "You shoot film?" he guessed, peering at a thumbnail image I had kept in the corner of my wallet. He had a way of making questions feel like invitations rather than intrusions. We ended up walking through the frosty streets together, our breaths fogging into the air, and he didn't flinch when I told him I worked by evenings mostly, sometimes in the quiet of the city. There is a peculiar kind of intimacy that blooms out of a series of small, unforced habits. Jonah began to appear in minor ways at the edges of my life. He sent texts about stray shows or a particularly blunt weather pattern. He asked, sometimes, if I wanted someone to take photographs of in return for letting me set up lights in his modest apartment. He brought me coffee when I missed group sessions with messages that were more concerned than reproachful. He had a knack for entering my personal geography without demanding an architectural tour. He sat on the edges, learned where my books stood, asked about the plants on my windowsill. He existed in my life like a new piece of furniture, at first curious and a little foreign, then comfortably nested. Marcus watched the change with an almost tender patience. He asked me in our sessions about Jonah with a clinical precision that always felt slightly tenderized by curiosity. "What does it feel like when he is close?" he asked once, fingers folded like a small bridge. I tried to explain the way my chest hummed when Jonah's shoulder brushed mine, the unusual vigilance I carried in his presence. I told Marcus about the strange peace I found in those brushes, a peace that muddled the line between friendship and something else. He encouraged me to map the feelings as if they were light through a lens, to notice the way shadows shifted. Language gives shape to feeling, he said. If you can name it, you can see if it fits. The group's ritual, which had at first seemed like something I tolerated for Marcus's sake, became the scaffolding of my tentative new life. Jonah and I established a cadence: group on Wednesdays, coffee on Thursdays sometimes, a shared silence when one of us had a bad day. He had a way of initiating small contact that balanced on the edge of plausible deniability. He would let his hand rest lightly against the small of my back as we maneuvered past a rink of bicycles, or he'd offer a shoulder for a sudden exhaustion without the fanfare of announcement. Those moments landed on me like stones in still water, a series of ripples that I learned to watch and misread and cherish. The ritual formed itself almost without being named. We began to share movies at my apartment, the projector throwing a wide, soft pool of light against the far wall. At first, he fell asleep halfway through sometimes, his breathing a gentle presence on the couch, and I would watch the small incline of his face as if cataloging a landscape I wasn't allowed to cross. He would wake in the dark with a laugh, apologize for dozing off, and ask how he could make it up to me. I always said something shrugged and easy, because my fear lived in the possibility that he would notice the ache behind my calm and retreat. What complicated everything was Jonah's plausible deniability. He was an adept initiator of physical comfort in precise, casual ways. He would offer his jacket without ceremony when the evening turned cold, drape it over my shoulders with the same ease he used to slide a film stock into a camera. When we shared a bed once, after he had a fight with his ex and had nowhere to go but the floor of my living room, he lay awake on the broken couch and asked if it was okay. He did not press an urgency. He asked the permission of my silence, as if testing the rules. "Do you mind if I sleep here?" he said, his voice a small, vulnerable thing in the dark. I told him not to worry, and then we both lay there, listening to the building hum. It was an arrangement I should have described in labels and rules, but the labels felt heavy as coats on a summer night. The more we stepped into the gray areas, the more my interpretation began to do the heavy lifting of meaning. I started to catalog every light touch as a possible confession. I told myself that I was being generous with the evidence, that even my own desires were persuasive liars. But there is an intimacy to being near someone who does not withdraw, and who, in the soft ways he reached for me, made it easy to imagine a map leading to a shared house, to afternoons with coffee and light. Jonah was the kind of person who used action as a language. If he needed something, he would show up with it. If he wanted comfort, he assumed the posture of comfort. He was not a man of declarations. He was a man of hands and of shoulders and of small, steady interventions that said, without saying, "I am here." It is possible to spend years building walls only to find, when someone begins to lean his weight against them, that the walls were not as firm as you'd thought. My interior life, which had been a careful, solitary architecture, suddenly felt subject to someone else's presence in the way that a room is altered when someone moves in furniture realigned. Sunlight redirected. I found myself monitoring the small expanse of skin at his wrist when he brushed past me. I found myself choosing to wake up early some mornings, knowing he would be in my kitchen making tea, and that we would slide into a comfortable silence over the kettle. It was delicious, it was terrifying, and every unspoken thing in my chest burned like a color I could not name. The crossing happened in an ordinary kind of chaos. Jonah's breakup had been acrid and loud, the kind of argument that left reputations dangling and friends ducking for cover. He stayed with me for a weekend because he had nowhere else to go, and because my couch had been neutral enough to host his woundedness. On a Sunday morning he woke early, left a note about borrowing some of my film stock, and returned shortly after with a cake frosted in a way that suggested he had been thinking of me, of my quiet office hours and my habit of taking tiny breakfasts while reading. We made coffee and sat at the small table in the thin light. It was one of those afternoons when the city seemed to roll back the noise and offer just the sound of a kettle and the hum of a distant bus. He put his hand on mine like a question, an ache. He did not make a show of it. He laid his palm across the back of my hand and looked at me with an expression that did not belong to jokes or flirtation. "I don't know what to do with this," he said more quietly than I had ever heard him speak. It was not a prelude. It was a real confession of being unmoored. He talked about his ex and about the ways loneliness had returned like an old weather pattern, predictable and cold. He admitted, with a fumbling honesty that made him seem smaller and infinitely more immense, that he did not know what he wanted from me beyond the way my presence eased him out of the old panic. I remember the sensation of the kitchen tile beneath my bare feet, as if it were a tide. My heart bent toward the possibility. I could have said nothing and let the afternoon remain a gentle set of gestures. I could have retreated into the safety of my carefully built solitude and pretended the thin, tidy life had not quickened into something fallible and human. Instead, perhaps because I had learned from Marcus that language could make a path through a fear, I found my voice. "Would it be okay if you stayed?" I asked, which was both a permission and a question. I meant more than the couch. I meant the idea of him in my life as a continuous presence rather than a visiting satellite. He looked at me as if he had been waiting his whole life to hear the words, and then he moved his hand from mine to the small of my back and pulled me closer until our foreheads touched. The first kiss was not cinematic. It had none of the Hollywood inevitability you see in other people's stories. It was a small, exact sealing of two hands that had learned to be brave in different kinds of darkness. When his lips found mine, It was like the soft click of a film spool beginning to turn, the moment the projector starts and the room leans forward. We both held our breath like we were peering into the first possible frame of a new film. It was tentative, slow, a mutual exploration of a border we had individually been circling for months. When the kiss broke, the world seemed a little rearranged, as if the furniture in the room had subtly shifted to make space. What followed was a period of exquisite, exhausting recalibration. The crossing mattered less than the fallout, less the action itself than the way it asked everything to be re-examined. Jonah, who had been fluid with intimacy in his actions, became quieter in the aftermath, as if the admission had frightened him into a new caution. He asked me to give him space to understand what it meant, to allow him to untangle old patterns that had been smoothed into motion for years. I wanted to label it as fear or as the blossom of something tender, but labels were clumsy here. Marcus, who had taught me how to name feelings and to let them be, told me that the real work now would be to ask for honesty and to tolerate the discomfort that came with it. I asked him one night, sitting on the edge of my bed as he put his shoes on after a late dinner, what he thought had changed. He looked at me with raw, complicated eyes. Before, he said slowly, I thought I could manage by moving fast, by not stopping long enough to feel the ache. But now, there's a weight, and it is different. I keep thinking I'm asking you to carry it, and I don't want to do that. I don't know if I can be what you might need. His voice broke then, not from drama, but from a sincere fear. He had been used to giving comfort without receiving an equal measure. Now he worried he would be a taker. I wanted to tell him that I did not expect him to be perfect, that my photographs my whole life had been built on noticing the imperfect light. I wanted to say he could be small and expansive at once. Instead, I asked him the practical question Marcus had taught me to hold in the palm of my hand. What do you need for me to be okay? He hesitated, the way someone might when choosing a film to develop. Space, he said finally. Time to sort the parts of me that are used to flight. There was an apologetic tilt to his tone that made my stomach knot. I could have insisted he stay, could have turned my fear into a fortress by demanding proof. I did not. I let him name his need without trying to fix it. And so, the ritual we had developed, movie nights and coffee, and the small, incidental touchings became a test of boundaries as much as it remained the comforting architecture of our lives. Sometimes we moved in step, and those evenings were luminous. We would sleep curled against one another on the couch, our limbs tangled in a domestic choreography, and wake to the light with the simple, deep peace of people who had claimed shelter in the same place. Other times, Jonah withdrew like tidewater, leaving me to map the emptiness he left in his wake. I learned to be with the discomfort, to photograph it sometimes, to breathe through it, to notice the way morning sunlight slid across the hardwood, and to consider the long work of acceptance. The moment he told me, in a shaking, earnest tirade, about the way his ex had been a thing he had chased to prove he was fine, I realized how layered his fear was. He had chased being seen as invulnerable, and in doing so, he had built a life of constant motion. When motion stopped, the emptiness became a room he had to enter and decorate with new habits. I watched him doing that slow interior work in the small hours books kept by his bedside on emotional intelligence, long walks that he said were practice for being patient with himself. He came to Marcus sometimes too, with my encouragement. Watching him sit in that quiet office felt like watching someone learn the grammar of his own sentences. It made me fall in love with him in a new language, the language of slow repair. The conflict that followed our crossing was not a violent, cinematic battle. It was stitches pulled through fabric, moments of miscommunication that became the true test of whether we could be both honest and present. I remember one evening when I came home early from a shoot and found him on my couch, his hands in his hair, the apartment smelling faintly of the peppery soup he sometimes made when he was nervous. He looked at me and said the thing I feared. Maybe this was a mistake. The sentence landed with a terrible simplicity. I had to decide whether to let my fear make a barricade or to ask for the kind of clarity Marcus insisted was necessary. We talked then, not as lovers in the first flush of adrenaline, but as people who had chosen to be responsible for each other's edges. I asked him to tell me what he meant by mistake. He told me, haltingly and with the awkward courage that comes from wanting to be honest and not wanting to hurt someone you care about, that at times he felt suffocated by the idea of being someone's anchor, that he had always thought of himself as a weather system unpredictable but free. He feared becoming a trap. I told him, equally plainly, that my fear had been losing him to the script of his old life, and that I needed him to know whether he wanted to be present in the long haul. "I cannot be your prison," he said. "But I also cannot be a ghost in your photographs." That line about being a ghost in my photographs became a hinge. It suggested the way love could be present and not present, like someone behind a window who only appears in the reflection. We had to create a vocabulary for being both honest and gentle. Marcus taught me that boundaries were not walls but shared plans. We agreed that night on small rituals that could act as testaments of intention. An honest text if one of us needed space for more than a day. An explicit check-in at the end of a week where we could say what we felt and what we feared. We made promises that felt humble and practicable rather than destined and grand. It was a new way of living with someone that required work and courage, and, most of all, the willingness to ask for what we wanted rather than assume it. There were moments when Jonah's need to retreat hurt like a physical ache. There were nights when I would stand at my window and watch the city lights blink and feel a hollow that I could not photograph away. Marcus's office became a place of refuge and of growth. He taught me how to reframe longing as a signal and not a sentence. He helped me learn the difference between the terror of losing someone and the ordinary sadness that comes with negotiation. Longing doesn't always demand resolution. He told me one evening, folding his hands as if to hold the concept tenderly. Sometimes longing helps you notice what you cherish. Slowly, the oscillation between closeness and distance became less punishing because we learned to meet it with language. Jonah stopped disappearing for opaque reasons and began to tell me when he needed a night alone to sort his head. He began to return with small offerings, a half-remembered lyric he thought I'd like, a piece of bread from a bakery that was better than it had any right to be. He started to let me take photographs of his hands while he repaired a bike, and he would watch in an almost shy way as I adjusted the aperture for the exact kind of light that made him look like he belonged in my portfolio. He did not stop being restless, he simply learned to ask me for help when the motion made him dizzy. Our friends, when they noticed the change, remarked on it with mild astonishment. Friends who had known us both separately for years saw in us a new symmetry, the kind of domesticity that is evident not in dramatic proclamations, but in the simple rhythm of shared chores and small, careful gestures. Jonah introduced me to his circle of climbing friends, men who could be loud and cultivated and gentle in equal measure, and I introduced him to my quiet world of galleries and late-night processing sessions. We were still ourselves, distinct and whole, but we found that the edges where we overlapped became the sweetest parts. There was a small ritual that grew between us, unremarked at first, and then impossible to forget. On Sunday mornings we made coffee together. It was not an exclusive ritual. Some weeks I would be up before dawn and he would sleep later, and other weeks he would be making a quiet breakfast because a nightmare had woken him. But the pattern held enough of the week to become meaningful. We learned each other's preferences, how he liked his coffee strong and black, how I would sometimes add a touch of milk when the day felt heavy. In these unhurried mornings we practiced intimacy by doing something small and ordinary, the slow art of making something for someone else. One rainy evening, months into what had become our new normal, we were curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like him and our weekend laundry, the room lit by a single lamp. I had an urge to speak a truth I had been rehearsing quietly in the margins of my day. Marcus's teachings flickered in my mind like a steady cue. The benefits of naming, the bravery of asking for what you want. "Do you ever think about the future with me?" I asked, my voice minimal and vulnerable. He considered the question like someone selecting film. Jonah's face softened into a series of small, honest features. Nostalgia, he said later, had always been his North Star. The future had been a map he liked to draw as he walked. "I do," he said finally. "Not with a plan pinned down, but with a sense that I want you in the picture." The image of us became a quiet revelation. His words were not a contract but a commitment to presence. The catharsis that followed our honest conversations was not cinematic either. It was a domestic rearrangement, an acceptance of mutual vulnerability that did not demand perfection. We moved together into a method of living that prioritized presence over proof. Jonah stopped apologizing for needing space because he had learned to ask for it directly. I stopped catastrophizing that each silence meant abandonment. The terror of mutual vulnerability, which had once felt like standing on a cliff with the wind in my face, became instead a shared stairwell we climbed, carefully stopping when one of us needed a breath, holding the banister for each other. Friends asked us sometimes if we were committed. It was a fair question, and I found that I could answer it now without the tidal fear that had been a constant companion before. Committed. I would say, in the sense that we choose each other deliberately, again and again. The word had shifted from an absolute to a continued practice. We did not erase the fear that had once tempted us into folding up our lives. Instead, we learned to live with it at the table, to turn it into a conversation over coffee rather than a silent, immobilizing accusation. There was a day, one of those ordinary days that later seem luminous with hindsight, when I photographed Jonah in the morning light as he was making soup. The cast of sunlight through the kitchen window sketched his jaw in a tender way I had seen before, but that seemed newly sacred. He looked up at me, flour dusting the edge of his cheek, and smiled in a way that said he had remembered something important. "You should frame that one," he said, and his voice trembled in a place that made my ribs ache with gratitude. In the slow, honest months that followed, Marcus's role was less about direct intervention and more about steadying the ground beneath both of us. He taught me how to continue noticing the small things the way Jonah's fingers would find mine in the dark like a practiced punctuation. The way he would add a new type of bread to our ritual, because he had noticed how I liked to try new things when the world seemed heavy. Marcus asked me once whether I was afraid of losing the freedom that had defined my solitary life. I told him I was afraid sometimes, but that the fear had become companionable. I knew how to work with it now, how to let it be what it was without letting it write the script. The new normal settled into a kind of gentle choreography. We argued occasionally, sharply, and with the clarity of two imperfect people who had learned enough to ask for repair. We also learned to return to one another quickly, because the cost of not being honest was now so high we preferred to choose the hard conversations sooner rather than later. There was a trust between us that had nothing to do with fiery declarations and everything to do with the quiet, daily actions of showing up. I learned to tolerate the disquiet that sometimes accompanied love and to recognize it as a weather pattern rather than an inevitable apocalypse. One evening, as winter leaned into spring and the city smelled faintly of thawing earth, Jonah and I walked home from a small gallery opening where my photographs had been hung in a modest show. The lights in the streets reflected off wet pavement, and we strolled in companionable silence. He reached for my hand, an old, deliberate habit now, and I found myself thinking in a way that was not frantic, but utterly calm about the quiet harbor of his presence. I had come to therapy for help with anxiety, and left with a new architecture for living, an intimacy that was not built on the dramatic and the dramatic alone, but on consistency and mutual bravery. "Do you ever think Marcus regrets nudging you toward the group?" Jonah asked suddenly, his voice soft like gauze. There was a teasing edge but also a tenderness that was always present when he asked about the man who had, in his clinical way, altered the trajectory of my life. I laughed, which was the only honest response to the absurd truth that a suggestion could be so consequential. "I don't think he would," I said. "He always said comfort was the enemy of growth. I think he meant that we have to let ourselves be uncomfortable if we want to expand." I grinned because the phrase sounded like something he'd scribbled in a notebook and then circled for emphasis. Jonah squeezed my hand and pressed his thumb against the inside of my wrist in a small, precise motion that had come to mean everything. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving without conversation." We reached my building and climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment that had been both my refuge and our shared experiment in domesticity. The key turned in the lock with the familiar sound of our small, deliberate life. Inside, the room smelled of lemon and baking yeast, comforting, honest smells that had become the signature of our place. We made a late cup of tea and sat on the couch with the lamp low. I told Jonah, in the soft way people disclose important things late at night when the world seems less loud, that there was something I wanted him to know. "I went to therapy for anxiety," I began, an obvious sentence that somehow carried the weight of an entire life behind it. "But it changed my life in ways I did not expect. I met you because someone suggested a group. I learned how to speak about longing. I learned how to ask for what I wanted. I watched him as I spoke, as if each sentence were a frame being developed in the darkroom, the image slowly becoming clearer. He listened, his eyes rimmed with a certain patience that had, over time, become part of his most compelling feature. When I finished, he reached out and brushed his fingers along my jaw, a motion that said what words could not, but that words had begun to make room for. "You changed mine too," he said simply. "You taught me that being still isn't falling. You taught me that it's okay to be here." We fell asleep wrapped around each other, the kind of sleep that has nothing to do with surrender and everything to do with mutual agreement. The next morning I woke to the soft sound of him in the kitchen, the clink of a spoon, the kettled steam. He made coffee in the way we had established, black and strong, and then, in a small, unplanned ceremony, he pulled out a stack of Polaroids he had been keeping in his jacket. They were pictures of our small life, a blurry shot of the two of us in the rain, a close focus on his hands repairing a camera, a candid of him laughing at something I'd said. He had written on the back of one in block letters, my name, and beneath it, a small, generous sentence, "Here when you need me." The resolution was not an event so much as a decision made repeatedly. Some people imagine love's conclusion as a crescendo, a single answering note. Ours was quieter, mornings and dishes and commitments made and remade. Marcus continued to be part of both of our lives, a touchstone and a teacher who had, with a practiced hand, taught us how to build doors and when to leave them open. We continued to learn, to misstep and repair, to argue and reconcile, to be honest. The terror of vulnerability did not vanish. It softened into an ache we recognized and addressed together. Years later, I still think of the threshold moment, the soft, uncharted intimacy on my couch, as less an accident than a doorway that had been open from the start. The therapist who had told me comfort was the enemy of growth had, ironically and beautifully, guided me toward a comfort that was chosen and reciprocal rather than default and solitary. Jonah, who had arrived in the periphery of my life with a laugh and an impatient breath, became the steady presence I had been too careful to imagine. He learned to tether his restlessness to a home, and I learned to live with another presence without mistaking it for a threat. We did not erase our pasts, we used them as reference points. I still photographed the world with the same patient hunger, and Jonah still climbed and moved through the city with the same quick steps. We remained individuals with separate histories and interlocking habits. But there was now an essential new pattern. The way our hands would find each other's in rooms and in the dark, the way coffee making became a kind of liturgy. The small rituals that declared we were both present and choosing to be so again. Marcus retired years later, sending me a note in a neat hand that read like a photograph developed slowly. He was proud of us, he wrote. Proud of the work we did to learn how to keep one another without smothering, to ask for space without fleeing, to build a shared life on the tender architecture of small acts. Reading his words felt like reading a caption beneath an image I had long loved. I folded the note and put it beside a photograph of Jonah laughing in winter light. The two objects together felt like proof that choices attested to the truth of what had become ours. There is a quiet peace in the shelter of someone who knows the exact angle at which your fingers curl when you are thinking, in the way you can be both needy and generous and be accepted as both. I had gone to therapy looking for strategies to cope with panic, for the relief of a manageable system. Instead, I was given through the medium of clinical insight and a series of small impetus, a human reconfiguration. I found a doorway where none seemed possible, and the man who nudged me through it was not a therapist but someone whose arrival could have been a minor footnote in my life until we decided otherwise. If you ask me now whether the anxiety was gone, I would laugh. The laugh of someone who has been with the weather long enough to know its cycles. No, it was not gone. But it had become less a defining feature of my days and more a contour we considered together. I learned to watch it with the clinical curiosity Marcus had taught me, and the tender patience Jonah had taught me, with his presence. Together we were, in a small and quiet way, rewriting two maps at once. So when people ask me how it happened, the dangerous little title they like to use, I went to the therapist for my anxiety, and he changed my whole life. I say that the therapist nudged me, but it was the entry of a certain person into my orbit that reframed everything. A man who could not name his needs well enough to avoid hurt came to learn how to ask, and an introverted photographer who had once prized neat solitude learned how to let someone in without collapsing. The change was not a takeover. It was a learning. It was two people choosing each other in small, steady increments, day by day, photo by photo, cup of coffee by cup of coffee. I tell this story now as if I have been granted the privilege of looking back, because it still feels miraculous. There are days when I still stand at the sink washing a plate and think of how tiny and ordinary things became the scaffolding for everything that came after. Love, in our case, was not a lightning strike. It was a series of careful monthly exposures, each one building on the last until an image emerged that had depth and shadow and light. It was learning to speak the grammar of need without fear of being judged. It was learning to answer when someone tapped on the door instead of pretending the knock did not exist. In the end, the lesson the therapist taught me was a paradox. Comfort must be earned, risked, rearranged. And the man who changed my life did so not by dramatic declarations but by choosing, repeatedly and quietly, to stay. We married the rituals of our days to a commitment that was unflashy and enduring. We built a home whose door was no longer closed against the world or bolted against fear, but left open enough for light and conversation and, sometimes, the small rain of ordinary trials. If you stand at the threshold of a life you think must be solitary, consider the odd and ordinary ways another person might cross it. A hand on your back in a crowded street, an invitation to share a film, a jacket thrown over your shoulders, a slow confession shared in a kitchen with a cup of coffee. These are not dramatic moments in themselves, but they accrete into a life that feels meaningful because it is chosen. I still photograph the light, still catalog the small moments. I do so now with his hand in mine and with an unapologetic reliance that is not weakness but the most practiced form of bravery I know. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as ordinary appointments. Some of them are indeed only paperwork and polite coffee. Some of them are the quiet hinge upon which everything turns. I went in for my anxiety and came out with a doorway, a partnership, a slow, steady stitching of two lives. The therapist suggested the map. But it was the map we drew together, an architecture of small truths and modest rituals that changed my whole life. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.